Hello everyone. Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, as I keep saying, I won't be impressed by technology until I can download ice cream. And as much as I would like to blame it entirely on technology, it's also a user problem. So apologies for that. I said all the amazing things that I had to say today. Um, but just let me welcome you again and just wishing everybody a wonderful moment of the day, whatever it is that you're enjoying on your time zones. And welcome to our parallel April series called The Inclusive Workplace. So over the next hour, we will be discussing about cultural competency. And I do see in the meantime a lot of comments coming in. Thank you for getting my attention on the technical mishap with the microphone. It happens to the best of us. Jessa, please help me make the most of what time we have left, and let's bring up the speakers on the stage. And thank you so very much for being here, for taking the time, for taking the energy to join us in this wonderful conversation. Now, the topic is cultural competency. And we are here to talk about building an environment where everyone belongs. And what I will do, as always, I will pass the e-mic around clockwise, and I will ask you to first shortly introduce yourselves. And also, what is the shortest, most value dense definition that you have for cultural competency and you bring into the outline of our conversation today? As I will give you just a few seconds, I will continue to welcome people in the audience and also encourage them to use the comments generously, and drop us if you have your definitions of cultural competency and anything related to the topic that you want to share with the community. So, Michelle, it's so good to see you. It's been quite a while. Happy to see you.
Good to see you again, Manola. Did you want me to start with introduction or?
Yeah, that would be great. So just a short introduction and what's your definition of cultural competency?
Perfect. Thank you. I'm Michelle DeTondo with Avion Consulting. I'm a principal. Been with the firm about 4 years. Prior to that, most of the experience I bring to the conversation today was as CHRO for MGM Resorts for about 10 years before I joined Avion. And since joining Avion, my focus has been mostly on creating inclusive workplaces. Cultural competence to me is throughout the organization, intentionally being empathetic of others and being both curious and understanding of the perspective of others in the workplace, especially those who may be different from the majority.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Malvika, welcome. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Hi, everyone. I'm Malvika. I'm the founder of Advis Group, and we are a human capital advisory firm driven with the core belief that in order to win in the marketplace, businesses have to win in the workplace. The way I think of cultural competence is it's really making a conscious effort to respect and value different and unique perspectives, and creating a culture and an environment where everyone is heard and welcomed for their unique perspective and experience.
Thank you. Jen, good to see you again. Welcome.
Thanks, Manola. So honored to be here on this panel of really strong women. So my name is Jen. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm calling in from the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Profit Consulting. Kind of just building on what both Malvika and Michelle named around cultural competency, it's the ability to understand, but also respect and value the ways in which one kind of honors different cultures. And I think the difference is really important in there, and that we all have different ways that we experience the world. We have different cultures that we come from. And cultural competence is the ability to honor that difference, respect that difference, and value that difference, while also understanding how do I honor my culture and come into that conversation in a way that's honoring mine and others' cultures and the differences between those.
Thank you, Jen. And last but not least, Nicole, welcome.
Hello, hi everyone. I'm Nicole. I'm the Director of HR and Corporate Communications for Singapore and Hong Kong, as well as the regional APAC D. I lead for McCann World Group. We're a full service creative agency. I'm calling from Singapore, so I think like my my time zone is very much different from everyone. But I'm very happy to be here. So I think like going back to your question on what to me is cultural competency, I feel like it's really inculcating inclusion in our operations, even with our business and strategic priorities. Like to me, like apart from what these wonderful women have also shared, it's really accepting the diverse, the uniqueness of everyone in the workplace and respecting that. And for me, like it's also like moving from tolerance to acceptance ultimately, for everyone.
Thank you all very, very much for being here today. And maybe before we address what it takes to build an environment where everyone belongs, we will just continue to outline the conversation and spend a few minutes discussing what does it mean to belong at work. And Malvika, I would ask you to be the pioneer on this one, and then everybody just please build your conversation.
Of course, I think feeling respected and valued are key parts of that equation. Feeling like you're welcomed for your unique background and experience that you bring. But I think one very important component of belonging is feeling like you're making a meaningful contribution.
Thank you. Who would like to go next?
I think I
Nicole.
can add, like, I think apart from what Malvika said, right, like a meaningful contribution, it's really like involving everyone, even in your decision making processes. When everyone is heard, when no idea or perspective is seen as less important, like in every conversation we can agree to disagree, like we can have different perspectives, but as long as you're listened to and people are responding to you in a way that it's not meant to judge you, but it's really meant for you to get in the same page and have like a better understanding of each other's perspectives to arrive at a common purpose and a common solution, for the works that you're doing.
I agree with both the comments made and Malvika's comments about feeling valued. In some research that we did in 2020 around feelings of value, the greatest driver was being asked for your point of view or your contribution, especially when a decision impacts you. So I think that idea of being intentional about asking for input and ideas, but also making sure that everyone's are valued, that everyone's input is appreciated, is a big part of feeling like you belong on a team. And being able to do that while you're showing up as your true, authentic self and not feeling like you can't be yourself.
I don't have much to add. I think everyone's covered it, but kind of building off of where Michelle left off, I think it's really important around, of course, about being valued, being asked for input, but in a way that doesn't dismiss your identities and the identities that you hold in a workplace. I think sometimes in workplaces, when we talk about belonging, sometimes workplaces actually mean assimilation. And what we're talking about today around cultural competency and building an environment where everyone belongs, it's one where you can bring your full self, you can bring different points of view, you can bring the identities that you hold in a way that's authentic to yourself and still be valued and heard without feeling like you need to change your perspective, that you need to assimilate, that you need to talk a certain way. And I think that's key in the acknowledgement and the difference, is that the belonging comes from being able to be yourself and having your own kind of perspective without feeling like it's going to be dismissed or retaliated against because of your identity or because of different perspective that you might have.
if you look at the conversations and the interactions you have on the topic of belonging within your organizations, I'm really curious to hear, are there any particularly prominent questions or topics that keep popping up? And who are the stakeholders, the key stakeholders that you have these conversations with? And Nicole, would you like to take a first try at this?
Okay, I'll try. uh, I think like for us, I mean, I don't know like for the other markets, right? I mean, I know in the US, it's really a lot. There's still a lot of conversation when it comes to like gender equality and all of that. But like at least for my company and like here in Singapore, it's not too much on like the gender. I think like we've passed that already. Like my organization, we have like a 60-40 for like female and male ratio, for instance. The LGBTQ plus community is also like very much welcomed, but like now it's more of inclusion when it comes to our work styles, inclusion when it comes to the microaggressions in the workplace that's coming into play. I think like these are subtle things that we may take for granted but are affecting the way we work. So like, especially like after COVID, when we return to work and the priorities of our people have changed. Like integrating their lives, like with their family lifestyle in their work has also come into play in, when we talk about belonging and inclusion in the workplace. So that's where I feel like we're moving towards, like, and that's what's been popping up, at least from my perspective.
Thank you, Nicole. Michelle and then Jen. Michelle.
I think that most of the clients that we work with just want to know what inclusion looks like day to day. I think that it can be an ambiguous topic. I think if you ask 99% of the leaders in organizations want people or employees want people to enjoy working with them, to enjoy coming to work every day, to be engaged and to feel valued. I don't know anyone that's ever argued against that. They just don't know what that looks like day to day. So, leaders want to know, what does it look like for me to be an inclusive leader? Colleagues want to know, how can I be a more inclusive colleague? And I think that started to evolve into, what does being an ally look like? And people just want to know specific behaviors. What can I do day to day to be inclusive and to be an ally?
Yeah, what I was going to add is that when having conversations of belonging, I think organically we then have conversations around inclusion and equity and diversity. And I think it's important to name that why belonging leads to those conversations is because belonging isn't a one size fits all. And when we talk about designing for culture, we have to recognize, because belonging isn't a one size fits all, because now, especially in the workforce now, we have 4 different generations. We have such a diverse workforce now globally, that equity requires us to acknowledge that we all come from different contexts, that we all come from different perspectives, and that we need to acknowledge that. And so when we design for belonging, we can't design just for folks who are in privilege, or we can't just design for folks in the majority. And so when we design or build an environment where everyone belongs, that's where it gets, I think, hard for people and hard for organizations and hard for organizational leaders, because they're saying, well, I have to design for belonging, but what does that actually mean when I have X% of my employee base is this and X% is this? And so I think, building up what Michelle said, the conversations that we have around belonging and around culture is around our processes, how we make decisions. I think sometimes when we talk about building culture, or building cultures of belonging, folks tend to think about like, well, how do we talk about it, which is important, or how do we have, make sure that we have additional benefits around, like, free food and all of those things, but the culture is in the in-between moments. Culture is how your leaders treat your most marginalized folks. Culture is how you share how your organization makes decisions, right? And how you do that in centering the most marginalized is how you build an environment where everyone belongs, rather than where just a few folks or folks in majority or folks from privileged identities belong.
Malvika.
Jen, that was a mic drop. I couldn't agree more with what Jen said. What I hear, before I founded my own firm, I used to be a CHRO. I was a 3-time CHRO. And now I talk to companies of all different kinds and sizes and stages. And what I hear a lot from employees is they don't understand how things get done or how decisions are made always. Sometimes in a tech company, people who don't work in tech and product may feel like second-class citizens. Or, in a manufacturing company, if you don't work in operations or in a plant, you may feel like a second-class citizen. So I don't think that the leaders in these companies are making a conscious, deliberate effort to make anyone feel less than, but inadvertently, through the way that they've designed their processes, how decisions are made and how work gets done, they end up creating an environment where people don't understand how their work is making a meaningful impact. So I think a lot of leaders underestimate the value of purpose and helping people connect what they're doing to the broader organizational purpose. So just to kind of give everyone a very quick story, in 1962, at the height of the space wars, when President Kennedy visited NASA, he noticed, a janitor in the corner holding a broom, and he went up to that person and asked, "Hey, I'm Jack Kennedy. What are you doing?" And the person answered, "Well, Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon." Right? And that is the power of purpose. And so when you feel and understand that your work is connected to the broader organizational purpose, then automatically you have a sense of belonging because you understand how your work is contributing to moving the organization forward.
Thank you, Malvika. Jen, I saw you unmuted there for a second. Please jump back in.
Yeah, as Malvika was speaking, it made me think of too around, in addition to kind of purpose and motivation that your employees have, it's also important to have a vehicle or a process where you're hearing from your employees. I think it's important that you have tools both for the quantitative and qualitative ways that you can understand where your employee base is at, and then doing your due diligence as an organization, as a people team, as a leadership team to respond to those. So whether that is organizations have kind of like pulse-like surveys, have anonymous reporting tools, those types of things, and in addition to having the processes, following that up. So I think it's important to be data informed in the approach as well, rather than just kind of, this is how I feel things are going, because then you get into a cycle where you, and by you, I mean leadership, people team, whoever might be thinking about what culture and cultures of belonging look like, you get into a space where you're designing for your own perspective rather than the perspectives and the spaces and the feelings of belonging of your employees. And so how you do that is making sure that you're data informed around making sure that you have places where you're hearing from your employees, both whether it's surveys or like having conversations, having focus groups, whatever makes sense for the scale of your organization, but having a process where people feel, your employees feel like they have access to the institution, they have access to leadership, and that those folks are hearing what they have to say and how they feel about where they're at within that institution.
I just want to say, like, I love how Jen said, like, the follow through is very, very important. Like, when we ask for data, like when you go have these surveys and focus group discussions, for instance, it's important for you to like also involve them and tell them what you're doing towards it. and involve them in the process on addressing, those feedback that you're receiving. Just as an example, like something that we've been doing the last 2 years is having a quarterly council in the organization, wherein we would tap like at least like 5 to 6 people from different departments who would partner with HR and the management, not just in our events, but even in our initiatives. So if there are also like policies that we need to revise, this is like your board of directors for the quarter. Like there's representation in a way. And that has allowed our people to have a sense of ownership also. And it's not just the management imposing things that we think is right for them. Like because they're the ones on ground, they're the ones experiencing it day to day. Like their involvement, like the collaboration that they're able to give allows us to create that better sense of belonging in the agency.
Hmm. I Michelle, you want to jump back in? I see you unmuted.
That I was just going to comment on, Jen's recommendation to have data inform your action plan or your behaviors. I think, important piece of that is creating a safe environment where people feel comfortable sharing feedback, which is, a big step in culture in an organization. Like research shows that women and people of color feel much less safe surfacing issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace compared to white men. And so, if we are collecting feedback and data, we need to make sure that our culture is ready for that and people feel safe to be candid, especially if they're in marginalized groups. But I agree that, and even intentionally asking for that, I think is a big part of being an inclusive workplace.
Hmm. Now we all, I'm sure, heard the culture eats strategy for breakfast saying, and I recently heard the second part that says behaviors eat culture for lunch. So I would love to take a few minutes and really go deeper into the conversation candies that you dropped around behaviors and inclusive behaviors. And Jen, would you take us through this?
There's so many places to start. I think because culture change and any change is behavior change. And that's why it takes a long time. It's not to say that you can't make progress towards those things, but I think it's important. It's such an important thing when people are designing for culture or thinking about designing for belonging, is thinking about what are the moments that we need to change behaviors, and then what are the processes that we need to shift in order to get to those behaviors. Sometimes organizations will say like, we need this behavior change, and so we are going to mandate the change. But we know that that's not how behavior change works, right? So in thinking and designing for culture and designing for that change, thinking about what are the motivations, what are the accountabilities that come with that, who is most impacted. And I think, Michelle, building on what you said too, is how are we making sure that certain groups have the ability to feel safe to kind of say, this is how I'm actually feeling about this change also. So I think transparent communication is really important. That is not a skill a lot of people kind of lean into in organizations around not just what are you doing, but in the process of when you're doing that, how are you communicating that with your employees? I think for organizations that have employee resource groups also, this is a great place to also like lean in with your most marginalized groups and understand where are our gaps and where are our true gaps, and leaning into those trusted relationships and then designing for the behavior changes. So whether that's leadership behaviors, and we also know there's studies too that show trainings and one-off trainings also don't necessarily lead to behavior change. And that's when you get into the processes and the accountability factors and how does those behaviors kind of lend itself to how one is evaluated. Like those accountability things are really important across the full employee life cycle. And so I think oftentimes when we're thinking about culture, we'll go to we'll mandate these trainings for inclusive leadership, right? Or we will do this programming around Women's History Month. But those things aren't getting to the systemic ways that we need behaviors to actually shift and change. And so that's why the people teams and leadership teams need to have conversations. If you want behavior change, how are you building it into your accountability functions and factors? And then how are you bringing people along in that? Because it's also not fair to build in new accountabilities without bringing people along in that, right? Because again, culture is related to the behavior change. And if you are a type of culture where you say, hey, we're just mandating this and you just have to do it, we also know that behavior change doesn't, we know that folks won't respond to that. And so I think it is a very kind of delicate balance of transparent communication with your employees, and doing that in a way that's in service of your most marginalized, but in partnership with your leadership groups.
Thank you, Jen. Malvika.
I think Jen made a very important distinction here between the what and the how. And I think it's, if you think about culture, some people will describe culture as it's the way that people behave when no one is watching, right? And so I think it helps to get really clear about who do you want to belong in your organization. And I'm going to be really provocative here and encourage us to really think about this, because maybe you don't want everyone to belong in your culture. So, in the early days of Netflix, Reed Hastings and Patty McCord, who was the then CHRO, created their famous culture deck, which went on to become this iconic document to come out of Silicon Valley. But in that document, they were very clear that they had a policy actually stating that we do not tolerate brilliant jerks. So what they meant by that is if someone is delivering results, but they're creating a toxic environment or they're disrespecting people, etc., we're not going to tolerate that. And they were very clear about how the cost to teamwork of keeping people like that around is way too high. So they were focused on both the what and the how, and they didn't want growth and results at any cost. And I think it takes a courageous leader to get to that level of clarity. So I think it's important to consider what type of culture are you trying to build and who really belongs in that culture.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Malvika said. Like, she did emphasize the what and the how, but maybe we shouldn't also forget the why. Like like we also need to be able to answer, why do we want to promote belonging in the organization? Is it just because it's the most talked about topic these days? Is it just like a PR thing for us, or is it intentional in a way that we really want to change behaviors or the overall culture of the organization? Leadership buy-in, I think it was also pointed out by Jen earlier, is also very important. They need to lead by example, while everyone needs to play a part in creating, a culture of belonging. Your leaders should be the ones to like do the first step also in showing the people how it's done, like, from the way they approach in meetings, or like, in general, like how people are treated, because the rest of the organization will follow suit, if they see it from their leader that they're walking the talk.
And I think oftentimes business leaders don't understand the business implications of having an inclusive workspace. And I think especially in the political climate in the US over the last couple of years, the why behind DEI programs, I think, have been questioned. And the way that I've always explained it to leaders is, do you need to get the most out of everyone on your team and have everyone performing at their best? And, typically with the things that are on a leader's plate, whether it's transformational initiatives or organization improvement initiatives, like every leader will say they need the most out of everyone on their team. And, if two members of the team are thinking about whether it's safe for me to express my point of view, or if another two don't feel like their point of view is respected, or if the one woman on the team is concerned that if she disagrees with a colleague, they're going to label her as being too emotional or irrational, then you're not getting the best out of everyone on your team. And so, Malvika started this with saying it's a business imperative that organizations that are inclusive perform at higher levels. I think that's like foundational to any focus on an inclusive culture in an organization, because otherwise it becomes the role of HR or chief diversity officer, which that's, I think, when, if you've been in those seats where you feel the uphill battle is because there's pushback. We can't spend time on this. We don't want to do this type of training or lead this type of culture change. If they don't understand that it's a business imperative, I think you have an uphill battle ahead of you.
I'm not ready to close this topic because I do feel that there's a lot of energy around what's the real cost of not having a culture of belonging. So, Michelle, I will ask you to continue down this line of conversation. And also, you mentioned it's so easy to just place it on HR. So, what's the cost of not having this culture? And basically, how is the accountability and the ownership distributed in an organization?
And, I think regardless of the type of organization that you work in, if you look back on inefficiencies, bad decisions, mistakes that are made in the organization, and, there are many we could dive into that are really public organizations that have had huge PR crises because of mistakes that they've made. I think they all go back to somebody had a point of view, somebody had an opportunity to challenge up, and they didn't feel safe to do so. And, I think that is essentially what inclusion looks like day to day is, do I feel valued? Do I feel safe? Can I be myself and express my point of view? And if everyone in the organization has that sense of, I can be myself and my point of view is valued, organizations make less mistakes. We've used examples in clients anywhere from like automotive to construction. And when you dive into where are we spending money doing rework, where are we making mistakes that could have been avoided, it all gets down to somebody didn't feel comfortable pushing back, challenging up, or expressing their point of view. And that's how we, really get leaders, especially white men who may not feel the types of exclusion that marginalized people in the organization feel. I think white men in the organization can get that because they can look back in their own groups and see those moments where if someone felt safe and if someone felt valued, they would have made a better decision or taken different action.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I think Jen alluded to this a little bit earlier, but so many companies spend countless hours and huge budgets on diversity and affinity groups and training, and all of those things are necessary. But I think too many businesses jump straight to tactics. And if you think about it from a hiring perspective, a lot of us are making sure that we have a diverse pipeline of candidates and removing bias from the hiring process and bringing in the best and most diverse talent. But the other side of the coin, of the diversity coin, is belonging and inclusion. And so when you don't create an environment of belonging, you've now spent all of this money to bring in an effort to bring in the best and most diverse talent, but either they're going to leave, or worse, they're going to stay and be disengaged or disillusioned. And we all know turnover and disengagement and people feeling that they don't have a voice, these things have a real impact on the bottom line. So belonging is, I think, an imperative, not only because it's the right thing to do, but it has tangible business impact.
I do, I think one thing that's important too, and I think Jen might have mentioned this earlier, having a distinction between, because I think we often mention DEIB together where I think they're very different. And I do think when you talk about inclusion, it is for everyone, that everyone feels like they're valued and that their contributions matter, where, sometimes men or white men can feel left out of discussions around diversity and equity, but they can totally understand feeling valued or devalued or feeling included or excluded. And that's like, we tend to focus more on inclusion and the specific behaviors that create feelings of value in an organization. But, I think it's important for us in this conversation, especially when trying to build the business case and explain it to others, that we can separate what DEI and B actually mean.
Yeah, building off of that, Michelle. Going back to your question too, Manola, around what's the risk when you don't design cultures of belonging. One of those is that you're essentially designing an institution, an organization that is continually marginalizing folks who are already marginalized, when you aren't intentionally designing for belonging. And I think kind of building off of what you're saying, Michelle, is that in DEI, and I'm a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've been doing this work for over a decade. I often tell people that I'm a systems designer with an expertise in equity, because I think when people think about DEI, they think about programming that's kind of over there doing its own thing. When really equity work, when done well and to have sustainable impact, it's integrated into all of your systems and processes. And when it's done that way, then it becomes less of bad feelings around, I don't feel good. Because I think oftentimes we're talking about safety, right? And psychological safety is important when thinking about cultures of belonging. But safety and comfortability are two different things. And people kind of throw around, well, I don't feel safe, when sometimes it's folks who are in privileged identities and privileged places where they mean that they don't feel comfortable. And sometimes that's the role of leadership. That's the role of the DEI team. That's the role of the people team, to be able to distinguish, when does someone not feel comfortable and we're keeping them accountable because we value equity and inclusion and belonging, versus when does someone not feel safe. And part of that, and going back to even just cultural competency versus cultural acceptance, is being able to identify that and bring folks along in that. Because when you don't design an environment of belonging, I think going back to what Malvika said, you have to decide as an institution, is that a value of yours? Because you can't speak to it as a value without kind of being really comfortable making folks uncomfortable when you're designing for spaces of belonging for folks who are the most marginalized. And there's studies that show too, like when you design for belonging of the folks who are most marginalized, it uplifts everyone, right? Because you're not further marginalizing other folks. So I think it's about, again, identifying where are we making sure that we're making people safe, but safe doesn't equal comfort. And how do we kind of build in that resiliency? Because culture, building spaces of belonging, building equity and integrating equity into your people processes and your business processes needs to come with a resiliency and also a willingness to learn. And I think going back, you asked a question, Minola, too, about stakeholders. And really, when it comes to culture and designing for spaces of belonging, your stakeholders are everyone. It's your employees, it's your leadership, it's your employee resource groups. And it's about how are each of those groups feeling, so that you can design a process and a strategy for getting to that kind of place of belonging for everyone intentionally.
Nicole.
I think they've said very good points, but maybe like something to add is just like, I think if we don't address it well, and we don't address it with urgency, it becomes a systematic problem, right? Like when it becomes harder for us to resolve issues of equity and all that. And we have to call out certain behaviors as quickly as possible because it has financial impact, it has business impact. It also impacts the engagement of your employees. Like, say, when you hire someone and they don't feel like they belong, it's not just them being affected, but that can also, it's like a virus, right? Like, they can also affect the people that they're working with, even if you feel like, you know, these people in the organization may have been like loyal to you or whatever, but again, like, everyone that you bring in the organization will have an impact one way or another. So that's just like something I'd add.
I do want to pick a comment that we have in the chat because it ties in with something that was mentioned earlier on in our conversation around listening to the people within organization. And the comment is from Gabriela. How can you effectively gauge the true sentiments of individuals and ensure they feel valued within large organizations? What concrete practices can be implemented to ascertain these feelings in such context? Who would like to give some ideas?
I can start just because I think earlier on I named some of the processes, and also I want to specifically name my role as a director of DEI kind of plays into what my answer will be. So I think in terms of practices or even processes in an organization, I think having either pulse surveys or anonymous reporting tools are important tools to have so that folks know, and making sure your employees know what those processes are so that they can share how they're feeling and whatnot. I think Michelle brought up an earlier point around making sure folks feel safe enough to share in those contexts. I think that's where, depending on the scale of your organization, your most likely your leadership or your people team knows, like, what are your spaces of belonging within your institution. For some organizations, it could be the ERGs. For some organizations, it could be their disciplines. For some organizations, it could be certain teams. And once you have a sense of kind of where people are having a sense of belonging, that's where you can also start to have those conversations around how you're sharing what those tools are and what you're doing with those tools. Additionally, in terms of like effectively gauging true sentiments of individuals and ensuring that they feel valued within organizations, specifically for myself as a director of DEI, and I recognize that I have a different level and a different relationship and a different level of trust with folks who are coming from marginalized identities. And I think that's an important factor for any organization to think about, like, what levels of trust do your leaders have, or your people team, or your DEI teams? Because when you're asking for folks' input on how you're doing in organization, depending on who's on the other end of that, who's asking that question, that will inform how someone answers that. And it's not to say that we should all ask these questions in an individual space, but it is strategically thinking about when does the people team ask for input? When does the DEI team ask for input? When is it, the executive team asking for input? How are you doing that? Who is communicating? And I think when it comes to engaging and collecting data and how people are feeling about the culture or the feelings of belonging, how are you effectively communicating, and who is communicating that does impact how folks are going to respond and how you are communicating what you're going to do with that data. I think sometimes organizations start with pulse like surveys, and they have really high engagement and generally are hearing a lot from the organization, but there's no follow-up. And if there is follow-up from the organization, from the people team, there isn't a clear communication. And so then engagement drops. So I think, again, just as much as you're asking the question, providing the resources, providing the processes and tools is just as important to create a communication plan with all of those things around how you're transparently communicating with the different groups and the different kind of disciplines and organizations and micro organizations within your larger organization, so that one, those feelings and those what folks are reporting isn't getting lost, but it's also that they feel like, going back to what we said earlier, that they feel a sense of purpose and they feel like they're contributing to what their organization is. And so that's why that follow up and the communication is key in being able to do that.
Thank you, Jen. Nicole.
I'll share like a best practice that we have been doing the last 6 years. So every year, McCann World Group, globally, we would close down our offices for 1 day every year, for an event we call Day for Meaning. And it focuses on conscious inclusion. So every office would have like a full day discussion around what are the things that are making us inclusive, what are the things that are not making us inclusive. It will be a day wherein we assess and reevaluate our policies, our processes, our ways of working, our day-to-day interactions with our colleagues. And at the end of that day, the goal of every office is to create action plans that would address that. So like, in this full day event, like, because it's the only thing that we're focusing on, you get the real sentiments of people, and again, they collaborate with us in addressing those. And like, we've come up, like, for Southeast Asia, we've been following this conscious inclusion framework that we've created, focusing on 4 pillars: conscious wellness, conscious conversations, conscious causes, and conscious connections. And like, whenever we create initiatives or policies, or when we need to assess our state of belonging, our state of inclusion, we try to like, put it under those pillars, so that again, everything that we'll be doing will be more intentional. And of course, like, this is followed through by like regular check-ins. I do one-on-one check-ins with all our people too. Apart from also your surveys, the pulse surveys, and your town halls, like, open communication and like those types of platforms would also like help continue that practice and process.
Thank
I do
you.
think too, if you have, especially in large organizations where there might not be safety to share your perspective on what the employee experience is like, you can look at data sets like employee survey just to see where there are differences between groups. And then with those groups, dive into what the experience looks like for each. So, with feeling valued at work, looking at, for groups that are giving feedback at higher satisfaction rates, what does the experience look like for them versus those who are lower in satisfaction? I think one thing that can be intimidating if you have an organization that has issues with psychological safety is being rounded up into a group to say, why are the Asians dissatisfied in this company? But, I think that you can do it in a systematic way. That's, what does your experience look like, and compare it to another group whose score is higher to see where the key differences are. And then, once you understand the differences, then use groups. Amy in the chat had mentioned that ERGs are underutilized. Use those groups to do the action planning once you've identified what the issues are.
Malvika, would you like to add anything?
I think all excellent points. If you think about really driving a culture of listening, especially in a larger organization, I think it has to be a kind of mix of things. And so think of it as a menu, not necessarily a recipe. So, some people feel much more comfortable giving feedback in a totally anonymous format. So they might, be super candid in a survey. Others might respond better to one-on-one conversations, like a stay interview or a skip level meeting with someone higher up. Others might feel more comfortable asking questions in an all hands meeting or a team format. in one organization where I worked, we did AMAs, or Ask Me Anything. So everyone on the executive team did an Ask Me Anything meeting every month. So I think it has to be customized to the business context that you're in. But I think it's important to have multiple touch points in multiple formats with employees, and then triangulate and see if there are themes that are coming up in all of those. And if there are certain things that are coming up in surveys that are not coming up elsewhere, which may also be indicative of a psychological safety issue.
Thank you all. Now we are 9 minutes away from saying goodbye. This was just too short time for this topic. But if I look back, almost without exception, all conversations around belonging at work do end up spending some time on discussing teams and team dynamics and team rituals, team routines. So I would ask for your inspiration and some actionable insights. Can each of you share one particularly meaningful and effective team practice that you saw creating or helping creating belonging at work? And maybe just in the interest of time, we will go counterclockwise. So Nicole, I will ask you to go first, and then we work up Jen, Malvika, and Michelle.
Okay, I think like for us, it's like having employee spotlights. So we would like pick people in the team to share something that people don't know about them, like, and even something more personal. Like we also like give them the liberty to share that, and it allows people to empathize with them. There are things that you'd find out about employees, and through by learning about each other's stories, we're able to create a team dynamics where everyone feel like they belong. Like the people would know also how to support their colleagues in like different ways based on what they would learn about like these diverse individuals or the unique experiences of our people, and that has helped in like our team dynamics overall.
Thank you, Nicole.
Two things come up for me when I think about kind of the team dynamic and what that means. So one, starting even just your meetings or your team kind of meeting team check-ins with a check-in. Just allowing for folks to like step into their humanity before they happen to step into the work does so much for team culture, and also create spaces of belonging for folks to kind of share where they're at. So a check-in could even be something as like a stand-up can be as something as simple as like choose an emoji for how you're feeling today, how you're coming into today. Again, it just allows for that humanity piece. And I think the second thing is on your teams, creating space for folks to talk about how they work. I think sometimes we project onto other people, especially leaders are just expected. We have unset expectations, and then we know that unset expectations go unmet. So when you have kind of direct conversations and you create space around like what's your communication style, what's your working style, what are your best hours that you work, allows for folks to have a sense of belonging because they feel like they have agency, right, and how they're working with their team. So those are kind of like two things that came to mind when you asked that, Manila.
Thank you.
I think for me, making it part of the hiring process, so really starting early on in that employee experience journey is key. If we believe that belonging is everyone's responsibility, then assess talent accordingly. So ask people in interviews what they've done in the past to contribute to creating a culture of belonging. How did they get help a new hire get acclimated? Did they ever go above and beyond to help a coworker? Did they ever help someone when they knew that they wouldn't get any tangible benefit out of helping that person? So in a world where relationships, especially work relationships, are turning so transactional, I think enforcing the value of belonging, starting with the interview process and then embedding it into every part of the employee experience journey from there.
And then I would add just like very specific behavior. If, whenever leaders ask like, what's one thing I could do? I would always recommend just being very intentional about getting the point of view from everyone on your team when you're making a decision. I think oftentimes as leaders, it's easy in a group meeting just to rely on those two voices that always have something to say. Typically, they're the people that feel the safest in the organization and feel like they have the most power. And so, those, whether it may be because of personality characteristics of being more introverted, or because they're marginalized, second guessing their point of view, may not contribute their ideas, but being intentional of asking each person on your team what their point of view is before making a decision, especially if it impacts them.
Mm. Now, this was a surprisingly efficient round of answers, and we are left with 4 more minutes. And I was thinking, what could be a question that would allow us for mic drop moments? And here's the question. If you could name one critical skill or capability underpinning cultural competency, what would that be? And an extra layer of challenge, if you can think of something that is not necessarily usually linked with cultural competency, I'm sure that this will be even more powerful. So, one skill or capability underpinning cultural competency. Michelle.
I would say asking really good, open-ended questions is the skill.
Thank you. My inner journalist is doing a happy dance over here. Thank you so much. Malvika.
I think creating a culture of learning, and tied to that is the idea of creating safe spaces for people to fail and to learn from those failures.
Thank you so much. Jen.
I'm cheating because I have 2. So one, I think, is active listening. So actually listening to listen versus listening to respond. And I think this is a life skill, but self-awareness, because when you're not aware of your own kind of biases and the ways that you project onto others, then you're more likely that you're creating your own belonging rather than belonging for other folks.
Thank you. And Nicole.
I think for me, 2 things, like self-awareness and a growth mindset. Like we need to be aware of our own, our own biases, our own actions, and that will help us like translate our behaviors and ultimately embed that into our culture. And the growth mindset, like Lisa, like continuously learning and allowing people to make mistakes that will allow us to progress. It is also critical.
Thank you. Michelle, Malvika, Jen, and Nicole, it was absolutely wonderful to have you here. Thank you, everybody in the audience. Also, a especially wholehearted thank you for your engagement in the comments. And just as I sit in the energy of our conversation, I felt called to share something with you. So part of my every morning routine, I go and I Google, what do we celebrate today? And I do this every morning. So I get to celebrate anything and everything from International Nutella Day to yesterday was the International Day of Mastering Conversations That Matter. And it reminded me of one of my favorite quotes from an amazing book. It's called Fierce Conversations, Achieving Success at Work and in Life, One Conversation at a Time by Susan Scott. And here's the quote. Our work, our relationships, and our lives succeed or fail one conversation at a time. While no single conversation is guaranteed to transform a company, a relationship, or a life, any single conversation can. Speak and listen as if this is the most important conversation you will ever have with this person. It could be. Participate as if it matters. It does. So I do believe that very few other kinds of conversation matter as much as conversations around belonging at work, because they speak to our purpose and they do inspire each and every one of us every single day. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Jessa. And I hope I will get to welcome you very soon again. Thank you. Deeply appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.